City of Griffin Board of Commissioners, October 23rd, 2018. The first item on the agenda was a presentation from Carl Camp on Transit X. They called yesterday, and they'd like for us to hold off until they meet with the 75 corridor folks. They've already signed an MOU with Henry County to run this from Locust Grove to Atlanta Airport. So one less thing for us to deal with today, but it's an exciting opportunity if it's reality.
Yes, sir.
If you like the Jetsons, but could be a long-term transportation solution for not only this region but the entire country. Next item is to discuss further options for addressing auto repair facilities and the unsightly outside storage of vehicles under repair and operable vehicles. Since we passed this ordinance this past spring, as they work towards getting compliant, several of the automotive shops, as we discussed in the preliminary discussion, was that some folks have multiple bays, work bays in their centers and not as many garage doors. And so as a possible compromise, I'd like for us to possibly consider and discuss. Right now it's 4 cars per garage door into the building. What I'd like for us to consider is a possible 2-car and/or 2-car per operable bays. So an example is one business is A1 Automotive. They've got 5 bays, which would allow them to have 5 garage doors, which would give them 20 vehicles at this time outside storage after hours. They've got 15 working bays inside of their facility, so if we did a 2-car, that would give them 30 vehicles versus 20 vehicles. They've got plenty of parking. So Jessica, if you'd like to maybe digest what I've said and
preliminary discussion. What are you planning?
Well, I mean, I've talked with different automotive places since then. They've called me out to talk to the auto folks. No, just their feedback in terms of their concern. So I'm asking, they've asked us to consider reconsidering doing some amendments that we did discuss as some concerns at the time. So
before you start, what about all the people who have commented compliance, who have spent their time, their resources, their money to comment to compliance, who followed the ordinance, did exactly what we have been asking for the last 2 years or so?
Well, this has been in effect for about 6 months is when we passed the ordinance.
How long have we been talking about? So to all of you say you had these preliminary talks, but not on behalf of the city. This is just your...
This is just people's feedback they've given us, and I'm looking at is...
Right. And the feedback that I've gotten is, hey, I've gone out here, I spent my money, I did what y'all asked me to do, and, what do you think about it? How does it look now? And it looks much better. These people who have taken the time to do what the ordinance says. So if now we're even, the fact that we're even considering changing an ordinance just seems to be an act of waffling to me. And if I was one of those car repair places who had spent my money and my time doing what's right, now to find out that I don't have to do that because we got, I don't know how many people have had preliminary talks with them, with other people, about changing the ordinance after I went and spent my money to clean up. I wouldn't be very happy. So now I don't know what we do right for those folks that spent their money to do the right thing. Are we going to punish them?
The situation is you've got some folks that have a garage door for every bay, which
the situation is
other folks that only have a couple of garage doors.
No, sir.
That's fine. I'm just
the situation is we have an ordinance. That's the situation. Okay. This is what the ordinance staff recommended. This is what the commissioners voted on. This is what we're sending our people out to these businesses to enforce. The rules that we have made right here that we've been working on for months. When you said the past 6 months, been working on it for over a year, close to 2 years, and now we're going to say the people, everybody who's put their work towards this, staff, management, the auto repair shops who came into compliance, that we're even going to question and say we're going to change that? Is that what the majority of the board wants to do? Because I don't even understand why are we if we make a decision, at least if I make a decision, and it's been thoroughly studied, tested, people are having to abide by it, then I'm going to stick with that. It may not be popular, and it may not get me elected as the mayor of Griffin, but I am going to do what is proper in this position to make these people who have gone out here, and I keep repeating it because it's making me upset, that spent their money, who have done the right thing, who are trying to come in compliance with what we have set out to do, to clean the city up, to bring everybody into compliance. They've taken their time, did what they're supposed to do, and then we're going to punish those folks so that we can compromise with someone else. I don't find that to be proper as an elected official to do such. Now, if that's the thinking of the majority of the board, I want to make sure that, as I've said many times before, I, Rodney McCord, am not in favor of changing anything that we have done to help clean up our community at the expense of other people that have some type of political influence. I'm not in favor of that. So I can speak only for me. But if other people want to do that, they have that choice. But I want to go on record as one to say that I'm defiant against that. It makes no sense for us to put all of the work and time that we put into this, and we have all these opportunities to say all of this stuff way before 6 months afterwards because somebody wants to compromise. It's not going to fly on this end of the dais up here. So
yes, sir. I appreciate your opinion.
Okay.
The point is that you've got some shops that have multiple bays.
The point is we have an ordinance. Right. That's the point. We can talk about bays. We can talk about doors. We can talk about stairs. We can talk about cars. We can talk about paint. But what we're talking about today is the ordinance. We have an ordinance. What does the ordinance say? That's all this stuff, all this extra ad-libbing to try to make your position right. We had that chance 6 months, a year, 2 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. McCord.
So what we're talking about today is the ordinance.
We have public hearings. We have public hearings.
So let me go kind of through a timeline real quick, if we can, okay?
If it's not talking about the ordinance now, we want to hear about the ordinance.
So let me do
We
this.
want to hear what he's got to say.
Okay.
We originally, almost 2 years to the day, we started this conversation in November 2016. We had a workshop about cleaning up auto repair shops and actually, at the time, we called them thrift stores. But we were given a directive from the commission to basically clean up the city. So November 2016, we met with you guys at a workshop. February 2017, we actually had a quote-unquote car chat with the local retail shops. We were going to have another meeting later that year, but it got canceled because we had a conflict or something to that effect. But then in March, I think it was, we had the first public hearing. Okay, the repair shop owners came out, voiced their concerns, and I think you guys tabled that motion at the time. Then we came back in April maybe, and you guys voted what the corrections were, so or what the changes were. July 9th of this year, we hand-delivered letters saying, hey, we're going to start enforcing the code by, actually, I think we started in June, saying we're going to start enforcing the code July 9th of this year. And actually, we kind of went by and still said, hey, you need to start cleaning up. Kind of warn them again, and then start writing citation until August or September. So now we're to the point where once we started enforcing the code, people want to come in and complain.
Tucson, are
Okay.
we writing a lot of citations?
We've written several. And we have some people that have come into compliance. And some people are actually working on it. But it's like anything else that we do, no one believes that we're going to enforce the code until it starts happening. Then all of a sudden, hey, what are you doing? It kind of weakens our position when they come to the third floor asking questions, and we say, well, here's the code. Well, don't worry about it. We'll just go across the hall, or we'll call our commissioner. And that's what happens on a daily basis. So, what do we do? At this point, whatever you guys tell us to do, that's what we'll do. But again, it was almost 2 years to the day, November 2016, when we started this conversation. And everyone knew it was coming, but no one believed it until it actually happened. And so here we are again today. So again, whatever you guys decide to do, we'll do it. But just know that code enforcement goes out there and does their job, but then, hey, we're going to change the code.
And what seems to be the biggest obstacle for the ones that haven't become compliant? I mean, is it money? Is it space?
I can't tell you that. They would have to tell you that.
Okay.
And it's fine to change it. I get it. We change codes all the time. But you have some shops that are they're stuck no matter what you say. They may only have 2 bay doors and maybe have only 2 interior bays. So either way, they're stuck. What do you do for those people? You've got, let's talk about thrift stores real quick. The guy on Experiment Street, the washing machine place, it's been cleaned up. Down here on the corner, Little 5 Points, I guess,
Right.
It's been clean. Cater to You on Meriwether Street has been clean. And those are the thrift stores. And if you look at the retail shops, a lot of these guys are coming to compliance, or they're working to come into compliance. And that I can work with.
So what is the suggestion, that we do away with the ordinance?
I don't know.
My suggestion was, right now, if you've got, say if a building's got 5 bay doors, they can have 20 cars on their lot. But some folks only have 2 or 3 bay doors and have multiple bays inside of their work bays. So they're limited based on the number of vehicles, based on bay doors versus the number of spots they have in their facility. So take an example would be, with A1 Automotive, they've got 5 bay doors, they've got a parking lot that's half the size of this room, they can park 50 cars out there. But based on 5 bay doors, they can only have 20 vehicles. But they've got 15 bays, they've got 12 mechanics that are working, they've got to fill their whole building up at night, every morning pull everybody out just to try to fall into compliance. So I was looking at a possible compromise where you could either do it by bay doors and by the number of service bays you have, and the multiplier would be 2 times the number. So in A1 Automotive situation, instead of having only allowed 20 vehicles after hours, they could have 30, but their parking lot is more than large enough. It's clean, it's presentable. You've got Hill's Tire Store has 2 bay doors. You've got Neil's Transportation, he's only got 2 bay doors. So there are folks that have like drive-in garages, and so this is a point I brought up in the spring, but it wasn't addressed at that time. So it's just an idea that we can digest, but the board doesn't want to do that.
This is something that should have been considered before we passed the ordinance. And I think, if I recall, we were all in agreement with the work they had done. The staff has given us ample time to decide what it is. And this, for me, is like any other thing, just like the utility bills. Everybody's not going to be satisfied with what we come up with. But once we've given them a directive and we made a decision and voted on it, we can't go back and tell people, well, okay, we said your utility bill is due on the 7th, but we're going to go back and change it because you don't get your check until another day. We're going to go back and change yours to fit you. We can't do that.
It was just that they asked me to bring this up to the board for discussion.
Correct. So one other point of so the enforcement of this. So let's say that the ordinance does change. We technically would need access to see how many bays they have interior on the interior. Okay, and also our definition of bay could be different from their definition of bay. So it's not just changing the ordinance. There's other pieces of the pie that has to be situated.
Yeah, I understand that, and this is all stuff that should have been done before we voted on an ordinance. This information should have come forward, a suggestion or something.
Ms. Ward, I think all of this did come forward. I think we beat this horse thoroughly. I'm pro-business. I want to see us do business, but I want to see it done the right way. And we have an ordinance. We have people who took the time. They came into compliance. I'm not in any way suggesting anything about any of the businesses. I think it bothers and pains me more that we have elected officials that will go back against what we have set as a directive, and it's not coming from the board. It's just people out doing their own thing, and I don't know if that's proper. But we can take suggestions. I get complaints all the time. People come to me all the time complaining about ordinances, what we're doing, and I tell them, this is what we have voted on. I stand by it. We don't just sit up here and make decisions and say we want to go out and hurt someone's business. When we're doing this, it's for a purpose, and we're not up here to try to be the iron fist of the city and keep people from being able to do business. We're trying to make this a community where we can live. What's that slogan?
Live, work, and play.
Live, work, and play. That's for everybody. We can't just say we're going to look after this one group of people to the detriment of the rest of the community. Now, if everybody else is coming into compliance, then we all got to play by the same game. We can't change the rules in the middle of the game for someone else. I mean, I'm baffled that we're even talking about this after talking about it for 2 years. I mean, we've had other issues that have been brought before this board, but if you get to the right person, not only will they bring it up, they'll actually change their mind when it comes to some type of influence. It freaks me out. So on this end of the board, I'll discuss it anytime anybody got any questions about it. My phone number is posted. You can always call me, and I'm going to be honest with you. We have an ordinance. The majority of the board, I think it was a unanimous decision.
Yes, sir.
To take this directive to clean up our city. We have an ordinance in place, and you have to do what everybody else is doing. What the other Mr. Robert's Collisions, all these the washing machine place, all these people took their time. If so, what are we going to tell them? It's okay to put your stuff back out there. We changed the rules. Now you can move all your stuff back out there. Is that fair to those people? I don't think so. Is it fair to our staff who's going out to do this work to tell them, hey, that's not what we want you to do? 2 or 3 of us don't want you to do that. So the stuff that you voted on before, don't follow that. We got a rule in place, but you don't have to abide by it. We're not actually writing tickets on it.
Thank you, Mr. Court.
You're welcome.
I have a question. How, from the point that this was voted on, how long were they given to come into compliance?
So I think we did this in March or April, and we gave them a letter. We'll say 45 days out from January or July 9th, and we didn't really start enforcing it until sometime in August.
Okay. And in the interim of the time between when it was passed and when it began being enforced, were these same concerns brought up, or was not until the enforcement started?
Well, it didn't get to this level until the enforcement started.
Okay. So, but I'm saying, so there was a period where the rules were very clearly stated, and there was a grace period, and the concerns were not addressed during the grace period, but once the enforcement started, then the concerns were addressed.
Right.
Okay.
Any more questions or comments? Okay. Everyone good with leaving it as is, or do y'all want to look at making adjustments or changing the ordinance?
Open public comment.
This is not a public hearing.
It's not a public hearing. I mean, this was just for the thing I brought up for discussion. Okay. Thank you, staff.
Well, wait a minute. So the consensus, we're leaving it as is? I want to make sure that we're on record as that on that. At least I am. Okay. I want to leave it as is. I don't know about everybody else.
I know that we've made changes to ordinances over the years, and we review actions, and I thought this was a possible compromise to give those that have larger buildings with plenty of parking that are on site an option to be able to fall into compliance and be able to run their business efficiently and effectively. It was the request from them. So it was not to slap anybody in the face or to discredit staff. It was strictly to give another option, whether you fall into garage doors or whether you fall into number of bays. So,
Are you privy to why these concerns were not addressed during the grace period?
I brought it up. Well, I brought this point up when we were discussing Mrs. Ridgway's facility, which
But
ended up.
from the business owners themselves?
Business owners have called me and asked.
During the grace period?
Well, we've talked throughout the period of saying you need to comply, you need to comply.
Right.
But those that have larger buildings, large facilities that have fewer garage doors they feel like that there's this other option to possibly increase the number of vehicles they can have in their parking lot that are paved, that are clean, that do not have junk cars.
So I want to make sure that
Yes, sir.
I'm hearing you correctly. Is what you're saying is that in the grace period, while some people were working to come into compliance, other people were doing nothing in hopes that the rules would change again?
No. The individuals I've talked to understand the rules. They're doing everything they possibly can to fall within those rules. But at the same time, those that do not have as many garage doors as bays, so that's what they're just trying to say. Is there a way that those that have facilities and the parking that is large enough to accommodate and keep the appearance looking decent to fall into compliance? And so when I've asked staff in regards to certain folks, in terms of certain lots, even though they've got more vehicles, do they have junk vehicles? Are they unsightly? Are they doing their part as good citizens, good business corporate citizens, to do a good job? And so when I go out and walk around on the lots with them, I'm looking at like going, they've got them lined up, the lots are neat, their shops are clean.
I think my concern is the timing of it.
Right.
Because as has been pointed out, this is 2 years into the process.
Right.
And so I think my concern is why it is now that we're bringing these concerns. Is it an issue that because the enforcement has really started, that there is, oh, well, we don't meet the regulations, so now it's a problem because we're getting in trouble, versus these issues existed at the point that the ordinance was passed and they weren't addressed in the same manner.
And some folks are in compliance. They have not been ticketed. They're doing what they're supposed to, but they say it's a hardship. They said that they could, if they've got 6 bays, say 4 bays, and they've only got 2 doors, I mean, they could have more, they could have some additional vehicles left outside in the evenings and after hours. So they're just asking, is there a compromise to give those that have large shops with fewer doors an opportunity to be able to have more vehicles on their property?
It's like most other code enforcement ordinances. There's no perfect ordinance that's going to apply and make everybody that's involved happy. So, I mean, you could come up, as we did over the last months and years after all these discussions, you can come up with all different scenarios, but it's like no matter what scenario you finally pin down, it's not going to be convenient for in every case. So this is kind of what we came up with to try to be as liberal while still cleaning up the city. And there are different options out there that, that we understand, but it's almost like whichever option you pick, it's going to be detrimental to somebody somewhere along the line.
And there are going to be folks that try to beat the system and try to
always will
park, not do their good neighbor and have junk cars, and I'm not advocating supporting people having unsightly lots and having salvage cars. I'm saying the folks that have the facilities that are large enough, is there an option for us to give them a possible other alternative?
So is the consensus of the board to leave the ordinance the same?
It is for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not in compliance with that idea. I think in a lot of cases that we find things, I don't know whether we actually went in and inspected A1's facility to see whether they got the proper definition for bays or not. Did that take place?
No, so we haven't done an inside inspection of
But I don't see how we
any.
can make a solid decision on it anyway.
Well,
We didn't do an inspection interiorly because the ordinance doesn't have anything to do with what's on the interior of the building. We based it on exterior service doors because we don't have a way to get into these buildings after hours, and we're really not looking at the amount of cars that are there until after hours. So if there are 30 cars there during the day and then there's only 20 at night, we're not going to have any clue how many interior bay doors they have or service bays that they have. And people, it's very hard to define what a service bay is. So it's much easier to say, here's a door on the exterior of the building, and code enforcement drives by at 6:30 at night or 9 o'clock at night, and they say, okay, this is how many cars they can have. So we're not just looking at it from an aesthetic position. You've got to figure out what you can actually enforce as well, and that was what we could enforce, but we would have no way of knowing how many interior bays some person considered that they have versus what we may think they have, or what may change within a month or so if they redo their building. We wouldn't know that.
So we're going to go back and look at, if we made a change to this, so we're going to go back and look at 70 square foot they have.
That was a recommendation that we made at the beginning.
Some lots have more square footage on the exterior.
Correct, but again, you're asking code enforcement to go out there and decide how much square footage they have, then calculate based on the number of vehicles. It's just not easy to enforce. So if you want something that you can actually enforce, our recommendation was to do the number of cars per exterior service bays. We looked at several different ordinances around the state. Toussaint talked to a lot of his planning directors, and these were the options that we had, but from everybody that we talked to, this was the best way to enforce it without being too restrictive of what the business owner could do.
Well, most of the time when you make an ordinance or make a rule, sometimes it's got to be modified, whether it's 2 months into it or 2 years into it. It don't make any difference if we've got something that's not quite right. And what we're doing to this gentleman is restricting him on making a living. And I just don't see how this board can tend to say that.
I think our concern is not, of course we don't want to restrict anyone from making a living, but our concern is exactly as Mr. Smith has already stated, even if we do make a change to the ordinance, there's going to be somebody else that says, well, that didn't help me. We know for a fact there's one on Taylor Street that has 2 exterior service doors and 2 interior service bays. Changing this won't help him. So then he's going to come back and say, okay, well, you changed it for that guy and that helped him, so what about mine? What are you going to do for me? You're going to do square footage? You're going to do... And so it can be a never-ending process. But again, if that's what the pleasure of the board is, then that's what staff will have to do. It's just that we know we're never going to satisfy everyone, so we have to make a decision.
Most of the shops you're talking about, is I'll call them mom and pop for lack of a better word, is small, couple of bays, and that's it. This one has done a wonderful job of what he's doing with that big building out there. He does have 12, 15 places where he can put cars inside. That means that he can have 30 to 40 outside. And I've never seen that place where it looked junky to begin with.
I understand that, but I also understand from a prosecutor's standpoint that you can't base an ordinance on one person, and you can't treat one person differently than you treat everybody else. You're going to have a discriminatory ordinance.
We just make an exception for somebody that's got that much square footage.
I'm not sure that that's going to withstand a constitutional challenge on that front. I'm sorry.
Okay, so in terms of the poll, we've got 3 leave it as is for sure. Mr. Brock, I see you're potentially leaning towards possible. possible making an amendment, Mr.
Yes,
Hensley?
I am.
I'm kind of stuck in the middle.
Okay. So we have
Well,
one-
Truman and I are new. We walked in on the, I mean, I remember the vote, and I remember being all on board, but then I also remember this question of this square footage and the amount of space coming up, and I was trying to learn as much as I could. I even drove by and looked at it that night. But then again, I was in favor of being uniform, and Jessica's right. You have to, it could keep going on and on and on. I understand that. But for me, as far as an option, this question did come up even before we started enforcing it, or the grace period, or the conversations you guys had. And for me, we didn't really, me coming in new, we didn't address that part of it, because I guess you have to have a uniform, and I understand that. So given that I'm just coming into it, I know you all have worked on this thing for years, but I also know there is no one size fits all, and you are going to have, as you are enforcing these, I mean, ordinances do change all the time. I mean, I've been in government a long time. Do we change it now? I don't know, but I know that if you know, this is, you all own this city, this is your public. I mean, I do want to make the business owners happy, but I also want to have uniformity. So there is no perfect answer, but I would be willing, if we want to start this conversation, to look on a case by case. I do remember this situation, and for me, I wasn't really given a solution on this particular situation with the square footage. I mean, to me, I'm worried about aesthetics. Jessica's right. We can't expect our code enforcement to go out and measure square footage and whatnot. But, I mean, I'm willing to, if the board wants to look at this, and, you know, I am in no means, I am for our businesses in town, I am for our citizens, and I'm not I'm willing to compromise.
I don't think we can look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, I know.
You have to just have an ordinance, and that's it.
I know, I do.
They have uniformity, so I don't know if we would make a change to grant another couple of cars per bay. And that's not going to satisfy everybody.
All right.
So,
And if we, I don't think we can change the ordinance to please one person. If we change the ordinance or go back, basically what we're doing is changing the ordinance, going back to what it was.
All right.
No, ma'am. There's multiple businesses that only have like 2 or 3 bay doors in a large building.
Yeah, but
So
how can we tell, even
so that's where the
if a
ratio is.
business has multiple bay doors and they can park 50, 60 cars, and you have one that has 2 doors that can only park 8 cars, how can we tell them they can't park 30 cars outside, the 2 bays outside? And if we're allowing the other business to do, I just don't see.
But they've got to keep their
It's not making any
vehicles,
sense
but they
to
have
me.
to keep their vehicles on their lot. They can't dump them into residential neighborhoods. They can't dump them. I mean, they've got to be operational. I mean, you can't have junk cars sitting out there for parts. It was just a alternative, 4 cars per bay door, or
If we
2 cars per.
jump up right after trying to enforce the ordinance and change it, it's a joke.
I've been kind of staying out of this conversation because it's been delightful watching y'all go back and forth. As legislators, y'all are all right. I mean, you've got the prerogative to amend an ordinance at any time, but majority of you feel the current ordinance is not working. But the problem I see here is the law requires an ordinance to be both objective and reasonable. And there probably is not one size that fits all. You know, unless we have some way to draw distinctions or categories between these automobile repair shops, I don't know how we would ever satisfy this problem. Now, you know, Doug may have the right proposal, and that may be something they need to look at, but I know Jessica searched long and hard on this thing. We talked about it several times, and I think she probably went over every option. She and Toussaint, and nothing else seemed to be real workable at the time.
I think you make a very good point, but I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to be done with this. Hopefully we'll move to the next thing. I've been doing this since 1994. I've been on this board. I took 4 years off. I was defeated, and I took 4 years off. this is not an easy job. You get the first thing you've got to learn that I learned at 23 years of age. You make a decision. You work with the people that are working with you. We're not the experts up here. We vote on it. We have people that are trained. We have staff that this is what they do. They have gone out. Mr. Toussaint, Kirk, Ms. O'Connor, code enforcement. This is their specialty. It's not mine. Mine is to look at it objectively, to surround myself with a good city manager, good city staff, and make decisions based on what they bring back to me. And they bring back, and we have people that I think that I can trust to know that they're doing the right job. So when they bring it back, and you can check my record since 1994, and 95% of the time I'm in agreement with staff recommendation. And to go back over this I don't know if it's I don't know what's really taking place when I see that happens. When we vote one way, we get up here and we're in these closed doors, these retreats, we make all this noise. We're going to clean the city. We're going to do this, and we want our city clean, and we want to make this corridor nice, and we're going to do all of this. And as soon as someone shows up and wants us to change it, a few of us will start to backpedal on what we've said before, whether it's utility bills, whether it's the airport, whether it's the retirement plan. I can go down the list. And backing up on those, it does not make us look strong as leaders. It does not make us look strong as a city, as a board, as a staff, that we don't back our decisions. I don't own this seat. And people may not like what I do at all times, but they will tell you that I'm going to give it to you truthfully. I'm going to give it to you. If I made a mistake, I'll own up to my mistakes. But to try and fix and compromise and be friends with everybody, to curry favor a year from now, I just can't do that at the behest of the board. It's just not the proper thing to do. If these gentlemen need more time to come into compliance, that's something that we can discuss. But everybody else that has come into compliance, who has done the right thing, who has went out here, we're punishing them by even discussing this, to even talk about it. Because that's money that they had to take to spend to do that they could have used for something else. But we're looking at going back on this ordinance to make it right for one person when we had time.
It's not just one person, it's multiple businesses that have asked for reconsideration. And it's not waffling when you look at a situation from a different angle, Mr. McCord, in terms of being a small business owner and trying to figure out what's the greater good. We could go out and enforce our substandard housing and our property maintenance code, and every one of your friends and neighbors will be calling you, me, and everybody else if we go to the letter of the law in multiple ordinances. So this was just a request for us to digest. There's nothing wrong with reconsidering a proposal for the greater good of people that make business decisions in terms of whether they invest in Griffin and Spalding County or whether they go to another community.
There's nothing
and
wrong
I feel
with
that
it.
some of these businesses have a hardship that they've asked for us to look at. And if this board wants to look at it, great. But if this board doesn't want to, I'm good with us in saying, ladies, gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we've discussed it. This is where it's at.
That's you make it, man. You sound like a leader. If you're willing to do that, then I'm willing to do that. I write them a accord, stand with the recommendation of staff. We have an ordinance on the books, and I'm willing to stand by that. Now, if you want to change it, then be the leader you are and change it.
Okay. Any other comments? So I'll let each of y'all digest this more in the future. This is not a public hearing. This was just a discussion to bring out some facts and let the citizens be heard through their representatives. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Connor.
So hold on just a second. So
It's still an ordinance until it's an ordinance.
So we continue
four
to
board members.
We continue to
say,
enforce the ordinance as it is currently. Staff
That's
does.
the greater good, but I strongly encourage other commissioners to meet with the folks out there and talk to them and feel some of their concerns and their pain.
We got some cases in court right now. So if something like this comes back up in court again, what should be the direction of code enforcement, the judge?
To enforce ordinances.
Is that right?
I believe the judge continued a couple of cases till the November court.
She did, because it was mentioned that we were going to change the ordinance. Somebody came in and said that they had talked to commissioners and they were going to change it, so all the citations that have been written were continued.
So we had a judge continue a case.
Several
cases, because not this board met, but some people talked to a commissioner without any vote ever taken and said that it was going to be changed, without any meeting with the public, without any type of meeting going on, no minutes, no one there to take the minutes of these people who were going to take
before the judge. This commissioner, or I don't think any other commissioner, made a statement that we were changing ordinance. What did
the judge say?
What happened, and remember, I'm not the prosecutor anymore, so this is information from the current one. What happened in court was someone came in, and I don't even know what defendant it was, but somebody had received a citation. The defendant came in and said he had spoken to 2 commissioners and that he was told the ordinance would be changed. At that point, the judge said, well, then this could be a moot case, and I'm going to continue it if that's what they're going to decide to do. And then we'll come back in November if they've changed the ordinance and dismiss the citations. So since there were so many that were based on the same ordinance, she continued all of them. They have not been dismissed, but she did continue them because it was said that the ordinance might be changed.
That doesn't bother anybody up here?
The only thing that bothers me.
It bothered me because the judge should have gone ahead and taken care of the cases.
Yeah, no kidding.
Exactly.
But nobody, I did not tell anybody that we were changing ordinance, that I would bring it up for discussion.
Wow.
Just like we're doing today. To express their concerns. Moving on. Discuss proposed revisions to the procurement ordinance of Chapter 2, Article 4, Division 2 of the Code of Ordinance. Chief of Staff Jessica O'Connor will address.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. One of our goals earlier this year, an annual goal of mine, and a lot of it Toussaint's too, was to revise some of the ordinances that we have on the books that have not been looked at in quite some time. As we sort of alluded to already, there are different state laws or best management practices that change as time goes on, and our procurement policy has not been discussed since 2010, was the last time it was revised. When we started looking at that, we realized that there were a lot of issues within that policy that could hamper how we do business and the time and expense in which we do business. And so staff met last week to discuss potential changes to that ordinance. You should have a redlined copy of that in your material. I'll go through it briefly. There's only a few things that are a large change that's substantive that we need to know your direction on. The first being, you'll see a lot of red lines about the word bid. And we realized in this ordinance that the word bid was being used in several different ways, and some of which were quite confusing. There are times in our ordinance that we do require what you would traditionally think of as a bid, which is that competitive sealed bid where you put it out to any vendor and you advertise it and you have a certain amount of time before it comes back and you open them publicly, and that's a bid. And there are other times in here where it didn't mean that. It meant just get a quote from some vendors and then decide how you want to, who is the most reasonable responsive bidder. So the first thing we want to do is remove the word bid in several different locations and change it with solicitation. That is a more prominent word used in the industry and something that's a little more receptive to what we're actually doing, which is soliciting proposals or quotes or bids based on what the actual project or purchase is. The The other change that you'll see is that the word purchase is a little outdated. It only really purchase is just talking about purchasing a good or a supply or a material, and procurement is more of the correct terminology in general accounting principles. So we're also suggesting that we change the word purchase or purchasing to procurement. The things that are more substantive and that we need your approval with would be the amount of items or the cost of items that need to come before you or need to go to the city manager. Right now, we have two different things that we generally do. We either purchase or procure equipment, material, and supplies, and we also have different public works contracts. So you're talking about either purchasing some kind of good or having some kind of contract to do work. And in those two instances, we have different thresholds that have to be met based on what we're doing. Currently, if you are going to purchase a piece of equipment, material, or supply less than $15,000, then the only thing you have to do is have that approved by the city manager. We are asking that increase to 25, because if it's 15, or more than 15, we have to bring it before you. With the ever-rising cost of inflation, 15 is not that much, so we're having to bring a lot of stuff like a lawnmower that has been budgeted to you. You're seeing them on the consent agenda, so you may not, if it's been budgeted, may not notice that that's what we're having to do. But right now, instead of Dr. Keller being able to go out and purchase a lawnmower tomorrow, he's going to have to wait until 2 weeks from now to get it on the agenda, and it's getting a little cumbersome to do business. So we're asking that increase to 25 instead of 15. The other one that is a little bit bigger of a deal is the public works contracts. Currently, state law allows a municipality or governmental entity to do just quotes if they are less than $100,000. And a public works contract is pretty much any kind of work that is done on a public building or structure or land or something of that nature. And so we are asking that we abide by state law, which is $100,000. Currently, we have it at 25. So Dr. Keller has a roof that needs to be replaced at Still Branch. Well, that's $33,000. Well, he has to, the way our ordinance reads, competitively seal bid that. That could take 4 to 5 months, and he's got a leaking roof. So if it were $100,000, that 33, he could just go ahead and get 3 quotes, have that submitted, choose the best one, and move forward. Anything over 100 would have to be approved by the board. So those are the main changes that we're asking for. This is just a draft of the ordinance. There's a couple of things that still need to be discussed with procurement and finance. There were some changes that sometimes solicitation or bid needs to remain. So if you tell us to move forward with this and we put it on the agenda, it may change a little bit based on just those wordings, but the numbers that we're asking to be revised will not change.
Just I have a question.
Yes, sir.
On public work contract, up to $100,000, what was the previous amount?
25. It's 25 currently, and we're asking that it move to 100,000, which matches state law.
Okay, makes sense.
Any other questions? Look good?
I'd like to just have a question in general. How many instances on the public works contract, like you said, that there's 50,000, is there a general threshold for most things are coming in around this range, or?
Dr. Keller, you probably can answer that.
They must come in well over that range.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I'm saying, so increasing this is just going to be a fraction of.
Right, you're not going to see much change, I don't think. It's just like this one is.
It's roofs, paving, moving a small water line. Some of the, and Phil's got the same issues, is that, okay, at $25,000, you just now cost the general public $33,000 because you're going to need $7,000 of the architect or an engineer, and all you're trying to do is move a 12-inch water line out of the street is one example.
Or building like a bathroom. Building a bathroom somewhere that may cost you $75,000. Now you got to get an architectural drawing, surveys, and all this stuff in order to bid it. Because you got to have those documents to put on the street for a bid. So that $75,000 bathroom is going to cost you $85,000.
But non-emergency stuff would still come like on the consent agenda?
No, not if it's less than $100,000.
But if it's in the budget?
Well, if it's less than $100,000, it would not come before the commission. If it's not in the budget, then we would have to bring a budget amendment to you.
So as long as it's a budgeted item that's within the budget?
No, as long as it's less than
$100,000. You won't.
Budgeted or not.
When you adopt your budget each year, you're actually appropriating for that purpose in that amount.
But if that amount's not in the budget?
It's either not in the budget, or if it comes in above that amount.
In a non-emergency.
It's got to come back.
Okay.
Well, emergencies would have to come to you as well.
Right. If we, as you've seen, we've had to declare an emergency for the landfill, for example. And so because we did that, that's all, you are the only people that can declare an emergency for us to exceed the state law requirement of the competitive sealed bids. If it's less than $100,000, what we're asking is that we don't have to do a competitive sealed bid. We still have to get quotes and then use the most responsible proposal or quote that we receive back, and then we can make that decision. If it's over $100,000, it will always come back before you.
Sound good, everybody?
Yep. Streamlining.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Mr. Connor. All right, so I understand our next presentation is on the status of the pending telecommunications issues confronting the city, including the deployment of broadband and the 5G rollout of small antenna within public right-of-ways under state and federal law. City Attorney Drew Whalen, and he promised me he would keep this to the length of his speech, being now the president.
It won't go beyond an hour.
5B presentation.
Yes, sir. So I understand you spoke for only 5 minutes.
That's correct.
And that was probably a shocker.
No, I don't think so.
We can go for 5 minutes again right now to shock us.
We had it written and rehearsed.
Yes, sir.
All right, Teresa's got it coming up here on the screen and all. I'm glad that Brant, Dan, and Tucson are here, because this is certainly going to impact them and their departments going forward, I feel like. And let me say in introduction that about a year ago, I came before you, and we talked about telecommunications and the deployment of broadband and the rollout of 5G. 5G really does not exist today. You don't have a phone on the market today that's capable of using 5G technology. It's going to be assigned to, or it has been assigned to, a whole different range of frequencies by the FCC. The current cell phones, your 4G phones, operate at a different frequency level. So this is yet to come. And I know as elected officials, y'all have been going to GMA and to other classes and hearing a lot about telecommunications issues now for some time. But 5G supposedly is going to be the biggest advance in technology that we've ever experienced in our lifetimes. And I saw an article just the other day that right now there are about 26,000 small cell antenna sites in the United States, continental United States. But by the year 2025, there'll probably be over 1 million. So these things are going to become very popular is what I wanted to say. I don't know if that's really the case. They're going to be there, and there are going to be a lot of them. And they're going to be right here in Griffin, Georgia. So what I wanted to do is kind of bring you up to speed as to where we are. A year ago when we talked about this, I told you that we were kind of under assault from 3 different directions. First off, Congress had a number of bills pending. They still have even more bills pending today, and they hadn't acted on any of them. They cover the waterfront. You've got the FCC, a federal administrative agency, which is charged by Congress to administer the area and regulate the area of telecommunications, which includes these topics. And then you've had the Georgia General Assembly, which we're going to start off talking about a little bit, and what they have done thus far, and whether or not that's even something we need to be concerned about. So let's get started. If you'll Teresa, if you'll roll over. What I want to do is give you just a couple of pictures to let you really see what it is we're looking at. This is a AT&T small cell antenna that's down in South Georgia, and it was put in as a test last year by AT&T of how to expand broadband into the rural areas. It uses a microwave dish, but look where it's sitting. It's at the top of an electric utility pole above the electric space, which I think Dan would certainly tell you we don't need telecom folks in our electric area at the top of a pole. Now, technology is advancing. You see something new every week in this area. And about 2 years ago, you had companies which wanted to come in and put up poles at 120 feet. Today, most of these telecom providers will say if I can put a small cell at 50 to 60 feet, it works just as well. So they're conceding somewhat in their demands as to the type and height of poles. But that was the one that we saw not long ago. And if you'll go to the next slide. No, you had it. Come back down again. Yeah, they're not lining up there real well for some reason. This is another typical small cell antenna arrangement. Now, I understand there were 2 antennas in this project. These are not quite at the top of a pole. I think these actually are on a pole that the telecom provider put in themselves. But when you approve a connection installation of a small cell, it's not just a little short antenna. It can be as tall as 10 feet tall, and from the point of installation, if you tell them they can come in there at the within the communication space of a pole at, say, 22 feet, they could actually occupy from 22 to 32 feet. They can come out 6 feet. This is all under current federal regulation. So they technically could be anywhere within a perimeter or radius of 6 feet out, 10 feet up. So you can see it's not going to look pretty, it's not going to fit real well with most of our typical electric installations. The last.
Drew, on this picture, just because on that last picture, what is the actual, is it the 2 little white boxes or the 2?
Most of that is equipment boxes. I think the next picture may explain it a little better.
Okay.
Here again, I pulled this recently off the internet, and it's called the typical connection with related equipment. You'll see actually that the antenna, well, this is one that's, you'll note first that it's a concrete pole which probably has rebar in it, probably much taller than the wooden electric or utility poles we have here in Griffin for the most part. You've got the antenna in what looks like a bucket or a can at the upper left, extended out from the pole by a side arm. It drops down, there's a fiber telecom junction box. Below that, a radio pack, a grounding bar. You've got the wiring, the coaxial cable coming down the pole the entire way. And if you look at the very bottom of the picture, what you see is the electric meter. One thing about these things, they don't operate without some source of electricity. You're either going to have batteries, which will have to be recharged, you're going to have a generator, or you're going to connect to electricity. So you have to be somewhere that you can get that connection. I think Dan, in most cases, if they're on his poles, could feed off the pole, off the electric line himself. He can tell you more about that. All right, let's get into the meat of this and talk about what the state did this past year. On the last night of the session, the General Assembly passed a bill which actually picked up parts of 2 other bills which both GMA and ACCG fought throughout the session. We fought about 3 days before the end of the session that those bills were dead, but portions of them got picked up and put in this bill called Achieving Connectivity Everywhere, or ACE. Now, ACE promotes the deployment of broadband and other communication technologies. It authorizes and directs the Department of Transportation to make the state's highways available to public and private telecom providers. That is a big change, because up to now, GDOT has said, no, you don't go on our rights of way. But in the future, they have no choice. It establishes a revolving loan fund to be administered by DCA for broadband deployment, particularly in rural and underserved areas. I think between DCA and the One Georgia Authority, they're going to administer that fund. It charges the Board of Economic Development and the Georgia Technology Authority to promote broadband deployment statewide, and it establishes the Broadband Ready Community through DCA. We'll go to the next slide. All right. The thing about ACE is it's not mandatory. The state used the same approach or strategy that they did with the Georgia Planning Act several years ago. It was referred to as carrot and stick. We offer you some incentive where it's in your best interest to take this voluntarily. Otherwise, you don't get the benefits. So what they've done is they've added a broadband element as a minimum planning element to the Georgia Planning Act. Communities who adopt policies promoting broadband deployment in their comprehensive plans and enact a DCA model ordinance, which is yet to be seen, will be designated as broadband ready communities, and they can maintain their qualified local government status, including eligibility for state grants and loans. Policies include prohibition on exclusive arrangements for use of the right-of-way, and in some cases, I understand the city of LaGrange was one of these. They've been out front with telecommunications issues for several years, and they pretty well have kept the other providers out because they provide services directly and been doing so very successfully. The prohibition on exclusive arrangements for right-of-way, including favoring local government's own provision of service, must be competitively neutral, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Those are the three big buzzwords that you find in a lot of this telecom legislation. Public right-of-ways must become accessible to telecom providers. And fees must mirror the charges allowed by the FCC. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The effective dates for ACE compliance, actually it states an effective date of January 1, 2019. However, there are some deferrals for various components. DCA has recently come out with revised regulations dealing with amendments to your comprehensive plan. Yours is on for a vote tonight. Every 5 years you have to go back and review and revise the comp plan. So it's on tonight. So as I understand the new regs, since the effective date is not to January 1st, it will not affect us now. So the next 5-year review would be 2023. So I think we've got a clear ability to not take action under the ACE Act because of that. Now, as I said, the model broadband ordinance that DCA was to prepare, we were told back in the late spring and early summer that it would be out around October 1st. I checked again this morning when I came in. It's not available, and I think I know why. Of course, it was going to be written by the telecom industry, was the rumor I got, which really doesn't surprise me. Most of the legislation the General Assembly looked at last year was all telecom industry-based bills. So I think the reason you haven't seen it is because of preemption. The FCC just came out with 2 new orders within the last month, which I believe, and I think the FCC thinks as well, preempt any non-mandatory state requirements. They actually state in the small cell order that there are only 20 states with mandatory legislation already that complies with their new order. Georgia's not one of them. So I think ACE being a voluntary type of regulation probably is not going to survive the FCC process. I would add that the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative Program, that's the funding to be made available. It won't come out till July the 1st, if it ever comes out at all. To talk briefly about the model ordinance that was proposed, expect to see procedures, including time limitations, for reviewing applications and issuing permits related to broadband projects in, on, over, and below public right-of-way. Time limitations not met, resulting in the application being deemed granted, resulting in permit issuance. This is what's been the process under the so-called shot clock rules for macro cells or cell towers. They've been in effect since 2012. If you don't act within the time limits, and that was imposed by an FCC order in 2012. So if the local government doesn't act on the application within the time allotted, it's deemed that you have approved the permit, and what happens in practice is the provider comes back to you and says, okay, you didn't act, application's deemed granted, issue me a permit. And a lot of times the local government doesn't issue that permit right away, and you get hauled up on a complaint before the FCC in an administrative hearing. Now, thus far, the FCC's process has basically been to simply say, you've got to issue this permit. Quit delaying the process. That's about to change, as we'll talk about. There's a requirement for expedited local government review and written notice of all deficiencies, which if cured, result in issuance of the permit. And we'll talk about that more in a minute in terms of the new shot clock rules for small cells. Requiring objective standards for right-of-way occupancy is to be in writing and related to all utilities in the right-of-way, existing or future. Now, this is where Brant and Dan and Toussaint will probably have to put the thinking caps on. I've looked. I have not found anything, although I did find yesterday where GDOT has got a proposed revision for wireless applications in their right-of-way, which would amend what's called the GDOT Public Utilities Accommodations Manual. It's owned for consideration by the GDOT board at some future date. The writing doesn't mean we have to adopt this by ordinance, by the way. A writing can be a manual, a design manual similar to the current GDOT manual, which we already adopt. We've got two ordinances we'll probably be looking at anyway. One is the telecom ordinance, which basically was intended for tower sightings, not so much, although it does make some mention of small cells, but we didn't anticipate those going in the right-of-way. In fact, it says they shall not be placed on public right-of-way. And then we've got the right-of-way permitting procedure, which state law has allowed us to have. It goes back to, I think, 1973. It's pretty outdated, but it's dealing with true public utilities like water, sewer, natural gas, cable TV, whatever. Going to the next slide, cost, fees, and charges. The ACE Act says that you can't charge more than $100 per installation. And there's no discussion about what happens when a provider applies in bulk. Various cities around the country have already started seeing applications coming in from AT&T, Verizon, Crown Castle, some of these other companies, where they, depending on the size of the jurisdiction, they may ask for 500 installations in one application. So there is some interpretation that's going to have to be given to this if ACE survives. Right now, keep in mind that cities have for years been allowed to franchise public utilities to occupy your right-of-way, and in turn you get an annual franchise fee. For example, you have a franchise with the Atlanta Gas Light Company. They pay the franchise fee. Local exchange companies or telephone companies were franchised for many years up until 2008, in which the state basically says no more franchises, and they actually put a statutory sunset on any that existed, which I think was 2012, into 2012. But basically, you now get a 3% excise tax off their revenues within your jurisdiction. So that still comes to us on an annual basis. We've got other things like cable, which was franchised for many years until I think 2010 or so, when the statewide cable franchise law passed, and we get 4% per year off of that. Well, heck, there's nothing in this bill that says we're entitled to anything on an annual basis. Once they're installed and in place, that seems to be it, since it wasn't discussed. So there's no provision in the law itself for an annual recurring fee. The law does say the city has the burden to justify any fees or charges above $100 application fee, and you can also, it makes provision for the payment of the actual make-ready pole attachment fee, which is going to be present with either wireless or wired telecommunication services. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute as well. I think as I read ACE, it's assuming that the pole owner is the one who's going to do the make-ready work, including pole replacement where necessary. We need to discuss that in terms of one of the new FCC orders in just a moment. All right, going on to prohibited practices. Imposition of moratorium of any kind on applications, permits, and construction of broadband deployment. This was already done by the FCC in a 2009 declaratory ruling, so that's really nothing new. If we had an application come in today, y'all couldn't vote to declare, say, a 6-month moratorium to consider it. The law simply prohibits you from doing so. Number 2 is you cannot condition a permit on provision of any service or availability of service to the local government for free or at a reduced charge. Back when we were franchising cable television, it was very common to require that the cable franchisee install cable drops at maybe the city hall and police department and several places like that, which got free service for the life of the franchise. But that's been now tabooed by this act. And then, except for reasonable and cost-based fees allowed for processing applications and the make-ready cost, you cannot condition the permit on the payment of any other fees and charges, such as building permits and impact fees. So it looks like the intent, legislative intent, was to give them a free ride as far as these related permits, in addition to the actual siting permit of the small antenna that may be involved. Now, let's move forward with the federal law and regulations. Basically, historically, we had the Communications Act of 1934, which established the FCC as a federal agency, and it's the fundamental law promoting telephone service. The Cable Communication Policy Act of 1984, amended by the Cable Television Consumer Protection and Competition Act of 1992, expands the FCC's jurisdiction over cable television franchising by local governments. That's where they started putting the screws on us. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 expanded the FCC's jurisdiction over personal wireless communications devices, otherwise known as cell phones, but preserved...
Known as what now?
Cell phones. When you're going to call them a cell phone, you know, instead of a personal wireless communication device. All right. However, the Telecommunications Act, that's being an act of Congress, preserves local government authority over tower siting, provided it's done on a non-discriminatory basis. So what in essence Congress said is that local government, you still get the first crack at it. But if you don't do it in a non-discriminatory manner and on a timely basis, we're going to preempt your action and we're going to do it for you. And that's really where the FCC started in 1996 with their regulation of cell phones. All right, going on to the next slide. In 2009, the FCC issued a declaratory ruling that local government practices which delayed advancement of private wireless services, including access to broadband, such as a moratorium and high fees and charges were deemed barriers to the advancement of telecommunication services. The ruling clearly announced that moratoria were prohibited. Now, we're talking here about a formal moratorium. It's where you pass a resolution in a meeting that says we're not going to act on some particular subject until a certain time because we need time to study it and see if we need to upgrade our ordinances or whatnot in order to address this. So it prohibited formal moratoria, and it established for the first time what are called shot clocks for processing the siting application, tower siting applications for your large cells. Otherwise, and they also established this process of, if the shot clock was not met, of the permit being deemed granted. The FCC also set up that time their complaint procedure for hearings to be held in their offices in Washington, D.C. So there's a little subtle cost factor in there. If you get drug into one of these hearings, somebody gets to go to Washington, or you get to hire a Washington-based attorney to represent you in the process. The announced intent of that order was to speed up deployment of the 4G services. And of course, I think 4G.
Oh, man.
That's what you're currently operating on now. And the constitutionality of that order was upheld in the case of City of Roswell versus T-Mobile. So that's Roswell, Georgia. As we get into talking about these new FCC orders, the word prohibition doesn't show up as much as it did in these 96 and later enactments. What they say now is anything that materially inhibits the advancement of telecommunication services is deemed to be a barrier to that service. So they're lowering the standard on you. It's not a flat-out prohibition. All right, we go on to what next one. In 2016, the FCC initiated a docket called Accelerating Wireline and Wireless Broadband Deployment by Removing Barriers to Infrastructure Investment. That is what's led to the two orders that have recently been issued. But it was basically a year and a half of receiving comments. Local governments were also eligible to comment during that period, and a lot of them did. The FCC also formed the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which BDAC, which Larry Hanson, GMA Executive Director, was the only appointee from Georgia. We'll talk about that committee in a few minutes as well. All right, so from the docket and the comments, you've had two orders recently come out. What I call the moratoria order was issued on August the 3rd, 2018. The FCC in that order completely revises its pole attachment rules. I've already met with Kenny and Brant and Dan. The pole attachment rules by the FCC were, in the past, if you had a written agreement with a wireless provider, that written agreement took precedent. Under the way the FCC now views it, our written agreements may have been preempted. It looks like they pretty much have been preempted unless they comply with the a new procedure called One Touch Make Ready, which we'll talk about. The pole attachment rules basically define how costs are to be handled between the pole owner and the telecom provider, who may not actually offer telecom services. Under the way they've now defined the telecom provider, it can be simply what's referred to as a backhauler, somebody who installs the infrastructure but doesn't light it up, as Jack Poland likes to say. The new rule, or new order, adopts an approach it calls One Touch Make Ready. On every utility pole, you've got basically a clearance space at the bottom, at least the bottom 15 feet. Then you've got a communication space above that. That's where your telephone, your cable TV, your anything else relating to communications, which could be telecom. And then you've got the electric area at the top of the pole. So what One Touch Make Ready does, it allows the telecom provider themselves, through the use of a qualified utility contractor, which would come from a list that the pole owner would have to pre-select or pre-qualify, to go out really only with notice to the pole owner. They don't have to come to you and tell you what they're going to do and get a permit from you. They can simply go out if there's space available on the pole and make their installation. Now, they'll have a period afterwards in which they come back and give you basically a as-built drawing or as to what they have on your pole. Now, I think in many cases they are going to have power, so they're going to have to depend on like in our case, the City of Griffin Electric Department, to go out and provide that power at the time of the pole installation. But there's nothing there that requires them to come to us as the owner of that pole to do the work as currently is being done. There is a requirement if they want to operate above the communication space in the electric area. They have to let us know what they want to do, but they still have the right to have it done by that pre-qualified electric utility contractor. So it looks like they've cut us out as far as our own staff and linemen going out and doing work as such, except in one area, and that's where pole replacement is necessary. The downside of that is they put us under a 60-day time limitation. If space is not already available on a pole that they want to connect to, they'll have to notify the city and submit basically their plan, get a permit, and we've got 60 days to go out and replace that pole for them. And
Drew, is there a meter on each pole?
not necessarily. This time. It may be in the future.
Okay, City of Griffin's going to supply the power.
They could use solar, though. Maybe they could.
Unless they want to use a generator or batteries.
What they pay us, what they pay us to provide the power.
They have to pay us for our power if they buy it from us.
But they could put solar packs.
And, well, they could use solar. I don't have solars. It might work. I'm not sure.
They go out there and put the equipment on the pole, but they've got to have power one way or the other.
They have to have power to operate it, yes.
Who's going to install the meter if there is a meter?
Well, I think our electric company will have to still come out and do the install of the meter. And I assume that's going to have to be within that, time period as well.
If something goes wrong with their stuff and it damages ours, who's responsible for that?
I think we're going to have to go after them and hold them liable for it. I don't like this, but the FCC thinks that this is going to speed up the expansion of 5G and broadband.
Does that, the $100 was that for the permitting?
Well, keep in mind that was under the ACE Act.
Okay.
All right. Back at the time of the 96 Telecom Act, municipal and government-owned utilities were given a limited exemption from FCC jurisdiction over these pole attachments. The FCC takes the position that their new rule does not fall within the exemption and that we're going to have to come aboard in our pole attachment agreements that we may have currently are probably going to be nullified when this goes into effect. The other thing they do in this order, which really does have a material effect on us, is while we have a prohibition of express moratoria, this new declaratory ruling says that they also prohibit any de facto moratoria, which is defined as, quote, other government actions that have the effect of prohibiting deployment of telecom services, close quote. Now, what does that mean?
We can't make no ordinance.
Yeah. None of the lawyers I've talked with, and I've talked with some of the telecom specialists from across the country, nobody really knows what that means. One told me the other day that if a telecom provider comes stumbling into City Hall one day and says, I want to talk to somebody about your requirements for installing wireless broadband with small antennas on your utility poles, and you talk to them, and then they take the application forms and maybe a week later send them back with a cover letter with some questions in there, that maybe what you've done under the new shot clock order is actually started the shot clock running from the time they walked in, even though you didn't realize you had an application before you. So they may come back and say, well, that was, a de facto moratorium because you didn't start processing the application right away. So it's very vague. I don't know where exactly, how we're going to accommodate that. The other order, and the one that's probably even more dangerous than that one, was issued on September 26th of this year. In this order, the FCC concludes that to meet rapidly increasing demand for wireless services and to prepare the nation for 5G, providers must deploy infrastructure in significantly more locations, such as your public right-of-way. Refusal by a state or local government to allow use of right-of-way is declared to be a barrier to 5G, as well as the fees currently charged across the country, if they're greater than reasonable approximation of actual cost. Here again, it's a new term that we don't have any precedent for. It's probably going to take some either administrative actions or court actions to define what reasonable approximation of actual cost really means. Now, the order does set a new fee standard. Number one, fees must reasonably approximate actual cost, as we said. Two, only the objectively reasonable cost can be factored into the fee. So if you've got some services that you may charge for that they decide later, the FCC decides is not necessary, it has to come out of the fee. And then third, the fees can be no higher than the fees charged to other similarly situated competitors occupying public right-of-way. Well, what does that mean? Who are other similarly situated competitors? Is that just other telecoms who may have fiber already on your system? Or does it also include cable? Or does it go further? Is it anybody who occupies your rights of way? We got all sort of utilities out in the right of way. It's just a lot of gray area in this order is issued. And the last point is that the fee must include all application and permit fees related to a deployment, including siting applications, zoning decisions, variances or special use permits, building permits, electrical permits, parking permits, and grading permits. I don't know how parking permits got in there, but that was listed in the order. I would say that our zoning does not apply to our rights of way. So I don't see zoning right now under the current zoning ordinance that we use being a factor. But if it did, you basically, under the state zoning procedures law, have at least 45 days to from start to finish just by a decision by you, which then has another 30 days added to it if it's appealed. So it wouldn't make it in less than about 75 days. Going to the next, safe harbor. This may be the only bone that the FCC has thrown to local governments in this whole process. They say that based on review of their own pole attachment rate formula, as well as small cell legislation, which was mandated in the 20 states that I mentioned, which excludes Georgia, the FCC presumes that the following fees would not violate their new standard. And that is $500 for a single application that can include up to 5 small wireless facilities, with an additional $100 for each additional added facility beyond 5. and then a annual or reoccurring fee of $270 per small wireless facility. So that may be somewhat in our interest. All right, but what else does this order do? First off, aesthetics. Aesthetics and historic preservation. The FCC order concludes the use of stealth and similar non-fee requirements or conditions on small cell permits to be barriers which are almost impossible for the providers to quantify in terms of cost and the delay. The aesthetic requirements to be valid must be reasonably directed to avoiding and remedying the intangible public harm of unsightly or out-of-character deployments, but requirements that are not, in fact, reasonable and directed at remedying the impact of the deployment, they say will be a barrier and will be preempted. Bottom line is that it looks like the only place we can really look to aesthetic requirements is in historic districts, where you're trying to maintain the character of the area to be preserved. Related to that, if we'll roll forward, Teresa, is undergrounding and minimum spacing. In a nutshell, what they're saying is you can't force these small cell providers to go underground. This type technology doesn't work underground. It's got to be aerial, and it's got to be at the right height in order to work. As far as minimum spacing, same thing. It's going to depend on really an FCC engineer's application of radio frequency and whatnot to determine. You might not have one on every pole, but you might have one on maybe every third pole. The range of a small cell is only about 350 feet, is what I'm told. So that would be the maximum range. But keep in mind, we're not talking about one company coming in here. We might have a dozen. You might have several, because there's nothing in these FCC regulations that would limit us to just, one provider. And they welcome competition. In fact, the FCC says they want competition. All right, now, the new shot clock. There we are. They created a new separate shot clock for small cell applications. Right now, if you're dealing with a tower siting, an application comes in that is complete. We have 30 days to review that application, and if there are any deficiencies, to give written notice to the applicant of what those deficiencies are. The clock starts running the day the application is turned in. So if on day 25 we give them written notice that it has 3 deficiencies, it stops at that point. But when they turn it back in with the deficiencies addressed, it starts to run again. That becomes day 26. Currently, we have 90 days for the location of an antenna on an existing structure such as a tower. We have 150 days to approve an application for a new tower. Here they're doing something a whole lot different. They're setting up a shot clock of 60 days and 90 days, basically. You have 10 days in which to review the application for completeness. In this case, if you send it back within those 10 days or send them a letter saying it's deficient in ABC, the shot clock starts to run again when they bring it back. So it starts day 1, the second time around. But they've written the rules so we can only tell them they're deficient one time. If we have 5 things that are deficient, but we only list 3 in our notification, we just lose out on the other 2. We don't get to keep sending them deficiency notices. The 60 days now includes all of the, I'm assuming most of these are going to be installations on existing utility poles. So it includes, as I said, all the related applications and permits that are required, which could be several of those. In the failure to meet the time limits, the FCC says that this deemed granted process isn't working. So if you don't issue the permit promptly at the end of the period, and in order to allow the installation to go forth, the FCC says if the provider files a complaint with us and it gets before us, we're going to start fining you. It's going to be a monetary penalty. And nobody knows here again exactly how that's going to operate. So now instead of one shot clock, we have two. All right, let's go to the next slide, effective dates. Basically, ignore the first paragraph because last week, I turned this in to Teresa, I think Monday was a week ago before I went off to Texas. And on Wednesday of last week, we received word that the two orders have now been scheduled for publication in the, one's been published, the other's awaiting publication in the Federal Register. So based on the publication date, the moratoria order will become effective December 14th, 2018. The small cell order will become effective January 14th, 2019. Appeals have to be filed within 60 days of the effective date. The appeal has to be filed in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia within that 60-day period. There are already several major cities around the United States who have indicated their intent to appeal both orders. There's been coalitions formed. I've talked to at least two different law firms about these coalitions and how they're going to work. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, too, was whether we participate or not. We don't really know the cost mechanism at this point, but it would be some kind of shared cost arrangement. Y'all are familiar with these sanctuary cities and some legislation that's come out on them from the Justice Department. And several cities filed an appeal of that litigation earlier, and there was a stay entered. In federal courts, you don't get an automatic stay when you appeal. You have to ask for it. So the cities that appealed on the sanctuary order, only the ones who were listed as appellants get the benefit of the stay. The order became effective as to everybody who failed to appeal. And that might be what happens here. So that's something to be thinking of, particularly in terms of appealing the small cell order between now and, say, the 1st of March. There's also some talk, Susan Moore at GMA and I talked the other day about the possibility of filing in state court here in Georgia, basically on the theory that what's happened is the FCC order has taken property rights. Property rights are generally defined under state laws, not federal law. And I'm not sure the FCC has any inkling of what rights are actually involved in public rights-of-way across the country. I know they're not all the same. In some states you might not have any rights, but in Georgia you certainly do. And I think those have been impacted. So there may be a possibility of a third means to litigate. All right, so let's go one more. All right, where are we? Well, at the present time, the city's right-of-way is occupied by AT&T, which is telephone, Comcast Xfinity, which is under the statewide general cable franchise, and Griffin IT is out there. Applications are pending through ECG, which Electric Cities of Georgia, which serves as our agent for our members, from Unity Fiber of Georgia and U Singular Wireless, PCS. We've been holding those for probably 2 months now to kind of see where we were going with this before we brought them to you, and we were really thinking we might need to bring them to you for approval by the end of the year. Right now, I'm not real sure. The FCC has taken the position that the moratorium order from August would preempt existing pole attachment agreements which are inconsistent with its terms for one-touch make-ready. And its September order, the small cell order, will prevail in Georgia because we don't have the mandatory small cell legislation consistent with its terms. All right, can we go on? All right, so where are the next steps? Where did we go from here? this time, it would be beneficial for us to join with other cities and counties across the nation in appealing these FCC orders. The stay issue is kind of what drives me to conclude that. Both APPA and ECG, from a memo I got last week from ECG, indicates that they may also join in filing appeals because of the impact on our pole attachment orders, both the existing and future. We don't know for sure what they're going to do yet. So what should the city do about the ACE Act? Honestly, I think it's probably been preempted by this FCC order. I don't know if ACE will ever come to being as such in Georgia because it wasn't mandatory. Now, what happens in Congress? They've still got a bunch of bills up there, but commentators at least are saying that Congress wants the states to act first, mainly because of concern over property rights and the use of rights-of-way. And that also there's a lot of sentiment in Congress that the FCC is being a little too impatient and aggressive. The FCC is made up of 5 individuals who are appointed by the president. The current chairman, Agent Pai, is a former general counsel for Verizon. The other 2 Republican members both came out of the industry as well. The 2 ladies on the commission are females who are the Democrats, and one of them's got a history of not showing up to vote very often. The last thing I want to cover, one more, Teresa. We mentioned earlier the BDAC, this Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. They started working on a model ordinance for broadband, model municipal ordinance, which is not complete. They kind of fell apart back in July. There was a mass resignation by a lot of the local government members, starting with the mayor of San Jose, California, who felt like the committee was a sham and he was there wasting his time and money because the whole purpose of the committee was to be a rubber stamp for the industry. So he quit and several folks walked out with him. They were not able to get a quorum in August or in September. I looked yesterday trying to see if they had called a meeting for October, and I couldn't find an announcement on the FCC's website. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in the BDAC at this point in time and their representation of local governments. There is another model ordinance that's being pushed. It's being pushed by NATOA, N-A-T-O-A, who is the trade industry of the telecommunication industry. So guess who wrote that one? I don't think we want to adopt it. As I said, DCA has yet to release the model broadband ordinance required by the ACE Act. They may not get around to releasing it. I think Georgia law is frankly outdated in this area in several respects. Our authority to manage our right-of-way essentially says the powers of a municipality with respect to its municipal street system, unless otherwise expressly limited by law, shall include, but not be limited to, and keep in mind this is only for our municipal street system. You've got the state highway system inside the city of Griffin. We've also got the county road system. However, this power gives us the right to control the rights-of-way on the county road system inside the city. And it reads, a municipality may grant permits and establish reasonable regulations for the installation, construction, maintenance, renewal, removal, and relocation of pipes, mains, conduits, cables, wires, poles, towers, traffic, and other signals, and other equipment, facilities, or appliances